of honor.
That's fair.
So if he throws this on, does that make him a chicken nugget?
No. I lost a bet. Me and Brian went to a Nuggets-Clippers game, and I lost.
That's a beautiful
It's
jersey.
a great jersey.
You look great in it.
Thank you so much. I love the Nuggets. I love Denver. I love everything that they're about. Jokic is a great player, and he should win the MVP.
Yeah.
Woo! What a day for me. This is great. I love
You
it.
feel satisfied?
I feel
Well,
amazing.
welcome to Battle Ready. My name is Aaron McManus, and I'm here with my dad. I'm sure Brian cut together some kind of intro where I'm wearing a jersey. We made a bet. Look, my father taught me not to bet. I thought it was fun. It was a harmless bet. The bet was essentially we went to a Denver Nuggets Los Angeles Clippers game last week, and I bet if the Clippers win, he has to do something with the Clippers on it, and if I win, I'll wear a Denver Nuggets jersey. So they took some photos, did a little video. So here we are. You were listening to the Battle Ready podcast. My name is Aaron McManus, and I'm here with my father / my dad, Erwin Raphael McManus. It's good to have you here today.
It's good to be back. It's
good to be back.
It's a beautiful day.
It's a beautiful day. Not really, though. It's gloomy.
But gloomy can be beautiful. Aaron.
It's not that nice outside. I want the sun or I want it to rain.
All right.
I don't want it to not know.
You hate indecision.
I do hate indecision, which is probably why I'm so indecisive at times.
Mm-hmm. So it's a cloudy day here in LA.
It's a cloudy day here in LA. If you're wondering what the weather was like, is like, and there's a lot going on in the world today.
Yeah, there is.
So a couple of things real quick. Just for our sports fans, the Lakers are in 7th place in the West.
Is that right? 7th?
They
Yeah.
won last night.
They won
They're
last
still in
night.
7th.
Still in 7th, which is where they should be.
Which means they have to play in if they stay at 7th.
What are the Denver Nuggets?
We're 4th.
4th, right behind the Clips.
Yep. I think we have like a game between us.
It's a game, a whole game.
It's a whole game.
And then, which means it could actually change in the last week or so.
This is the last week, isn't it? Or
Yeah.
is it next week
There's 3 games left.
in the season?
Right. So it could shift.
It could shift. So just saying, the Lakers are where they should be. The Clippers are where they should be. Denver Nuggets are where they should be.
Mm-hmm.
And we're gonna get into some more serious things.
Yeah, I do think that, just a little side note, if y'all are always trying to get a little learning lesson out of everything that is meaningless.
Okay.
Last year, when the Lakers were in first place, LeBron had nothing negative to say about the playoff system.
Mm-hmm.
And now that they're in 7th place, he's really negative in saying that whoever thought it up should be fired. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how many times in life our opinions change when it actually has a direct impact on us, rather than when it has a direct impact on other people.
I mean, that's so many things in life, right? We don't care about it until it affects us.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's where empathy is actually developed, is when we can finally care about something when it's affecting someone else and not us, because we can put ourselves in their place.
Do you feel like, though, we've talked about this a bit before, do you think that we are slightly maybe coerced or guilted and shamed into supporting every cause that's going on in the world, and that we exhaust our empathy in those situations? Because, like, it does feel like there is a new bad thing happening every day.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is that you really genuinely cannot care equally about everything.
So, but obviously, it's in our good nature to be human, and in our human nature to be empathetic, I think.
That's the best view of us.
So I don't want to say that you have to be less empathetic about certain things, but how do we have a lot of empathy and a lot of care and voice the important things around the world, but do it the right way? And
not only how do we have empathy about more things or all the things that are out there, but how do we stay informed? How do we have knowledgeable empathy? Because I think sometimes our empathy runs at 100 miles an hour, but our information or insights running at 5 miles an hour. And so
we care more than we understand.
And it can be dangerous, right? And which is a part of what today's podcast was inspired by. You came to me and you said we should talk about the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Right.
And I mean, honestly, I was like, wow, this is such a big issue. I don't even know if I know how to engage this conversation, but it's important to at least talk about it.
And I think everyone cares about it to some degree. Everyone's talking about it right now. I think I messaged you on Monday and was like, we have to talk about this. And you're like, okay, go do some research. And so I've been listening to podcasts, reading articles, trying to understand a little bit deeper about, what is actually going on. And I was listening to a podcast actually yesterday talking about, I think it was a BBC journalist in Israel talking about kind of the local things that created what is now this really intense situation.
This most recent conflict.
This most recent conflict, right? I think I want to get into the history side of it, the biblical aspect of it, what's been going on for hundreds of years, for thousands of years in the Middle East. But I think this episode will probably have to be in 2 parts because we're still learning so much about this. At least I am still learning so much about this. And because we're getting videos and updates and articles and so much is releasing, so we're trying to understand as much as we can, and trying to take it from a different route, because I think people would look at it and go, okay, you're a part of Mosaic, you guys are followers of Jesus, and it's pretty common in the U.S. that anyone in the Christian space sides with Israel,
right,
and then everyone else seems to side with Palestine.
Yeah, and even just from my own background, I've been to Egypt, I've been to Lebanon, I've been to Syria, I've been to Pakistan. I have never been to Israel.
But you're going.
I hope to.
Yeah.
And but I made it my intention to visit the nations that are Islamic, the nations that oftentimes are overlooked and by
Why
those
is
who are
that?
Christians. One, I'm always drawn to the outsider, to the person furthest away from, let's say, Jesus, and and I'm always drawn to the people that I feel like maybe Christians don't care about as much. And I also have been to Turkey, so I've been through the whole Middle Eastern, Arab, Islamic world. And part of the reason I didn't go to Israel is because at that time you couldn't have a stamp of Israel to actually travel freely into several of those countries, and so I did not want to have an Israeli stamp in my passport.
Right.
And but I would be fascinated to go to Israel. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary part of the world, and its history is so rich, and it obviously is interconnected to our faith. But
do you have theological reasons as to why you've stayed away from Israel, or why or do you want to not go into this?
No, I don't have theological reasons. I have probably social political reasons, because I feel like Christians are always so associated with Israel, almost, it seems at times, blindly. And what it does then is it alienates everyone in the Islamic world from having a meaningful conversation about Jesus, because it ends up becoming political rather than spiritual. And so I've been to Lebanon quite a few times, and went to Syria, and went to Pakistan and had conversation about Jesus with Muslims. And even frankly being told in some places, hey, if you mention Jesus or talk about his divinity, you might be killed. And even when I landed in Pakistan on the airplane, there was an announcement while I was landing that proselytizing in Pakistan is a crime against the government and a capital offense. And so I actually experienced some interesting kind of dynamics in different places when I went. But once I was in those countries interacting with people, I met the warmest, kindest, friendliest people anywhere. And being in Damascus, which at that time was considered one of the most dangerous cities in the world, I can tell you when I'd walk the street, all these people would come to me and they'd ask me if I spoke English. And I said yes, and they'd right on the spot invite me to their home to have dinner so they could practice their English. And I never met people who were against me, or even against the United States on a just a face-to-face, human-to-human, person-to-person level. And so sometimes I think that people know how to get along, governments don't know how to get along.
Yeah, it's interesting. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start this historical context of the situation, or do you want to talk about kind of the social political situation that's happening now?
I'm not really sure. Maybe we'll go back and give a little context. But I think where I want to start with is today the conversation is about the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Right.
And whatever else we say or talk about, or whatever other questions we ask, we both feel incredible empathy for both sides. And
most definitely.
And the fact that there are people who are suffering and dying and losing loved ones in Palestine is horrific, and it breaks our heart. And there needs to be real global concern for the welfare of the Palestinian people. And at the same time, right away, someone sent me a night film of the thousands of bombs, that are going into Israel.
The missiles being launched.
And I think sometimes we don't realize that the people of Israel live under the constant threat of death, and so I don't want to eliminate empathy for one just because we have empathy for the other.
Right.
I want to express deep empathy for the people of Israel and the suffering they've experienced, and not just in Israel, but on a historic and global level.
Yeah.
And to realize that this is a conflict where there are so many victims on both sides.
Right.
And so I'm not entering this podcast, this Battle Ray episode, thinking we have the solutions,
right,
or we have the answers. But we do want to have this conversation, talk about it a little bit, and maybe just encourage people to express a humane response to people on both sides of the issue.
Yeah, it seems, I was talking to you about this the other day, and I was like, the people I follow on Instagram, it's very interesting to see that most people I follow right now, most of my friends don't go to church. A lot of friends do, but most of my friends who go to church really aren't posting anything about it.
Right.
It's mostly my friends who really aren't involved. Maybe it would be a different spiritual journey, which is incredible, but it's a process, right? And we're having conversations, but most of it would be like anti-Israel
sentiment,
saying like, the fact that Israel's it's a lot of it is like, I'm stumbling over my words 'cause I'm trying to be very careful. So, but a lot of it is like very much so like pro-Muslim, pro-Palestine. Israel is a terrorist nation, and the fact that the world has been watching this and not doing anything about it is an act of genocide and an act of humanity. So, what do you do when that is the starting point? Right, and then I'm seeing videos of like what's going on in like New York City, and there's like Palestinians and Israelis or Jews fighting each other in the streets, and then there's this like upheaval on the local level, on the international level, on the social media level, and then I was listening to a podcast talking about like, I guess there was a huge social media thing that went viral where there was like young Muslims like slapping Orthodox Jews on like the subways, and so then it caused a huge upheaval with Jewish people in Israel saying running the streets, going kill Arabs, and then it's on both sides, right? It's like, so
right, but then you have even on Twitter the elimination of Donald Trump's voice.
Yeah.
But then you have on Twitter someone posting.
Oh, what was her name?
A quote from Adolf Hitler. And that person, to me, should be banned for inciting.
Vina Malik, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actress, yeah.
Yeah. She
Pakistani
posted.
Indian.
She posted this. Should we read it or no?
I think you should read it.
You should read it. It's very interesting.
I mean, she posted it. She meant it to be read.
I would have killed all the Jews of the world, but I kept some to show the world why I killed them.
Adolf Hitler.
Adolf Hitler. Yeah. She has 1.2 million followers on Twitter. And then she deleted it after she's gotten so much hate for it, essentially. I think it's tough. But go.
No, I just want to say is that I have a lot of friends who are heavily, the Palestinians are the victims and Israel are the bad guys.
Right.
And then I have friends who are Israel are the good guys and they're the victims, and the Palestinians and the Muslims and the Arabic nations are the bad guys. And I'm sitting here watching this happen going, we can't even have a conversation without demonizing each other. How in the world are the Israelis and the Palestinians ever going to find resolution?
Yeah, I think she's a really good example. And her name is Malik. Vina Malik.
Yeah.
She's a great example because I think that example exists on both sides.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because there is in no world or way or reality that tweeting something about genocide like that to that degree is acceptable.
Right. It shouldn't
right?
be.
It shouldn't be ever.
Yeah.
Like on either side. It doesn't matter what side it is.
And frankly, quoting Adolf Hitler is just a bad idea. It's just bad form. You've already started from the wrong place.
Right.
And what's so amazing to me is when I think about it, like that we've had years now of conversations about white supremacy.
Right.
And I think we're clear that white supremacy is unacceptable.
Unacceptable.
And they would be the ones who would quote Hitler. So if this extreme right quotes Hitler, it's not a good thing.
Right.
But if you're now suddenly extreme left and you're quoting Hitler,
because of
how is that acceptable?
Yeah.
And I think
it's
we need,
not, right?
Yeah, it's not. And so I think what we need to realize is, well, first of all, if you're an extremist on either end, if you think like that one side, that it should be lose-lose or lose-win or win-lose.
Right.
I don't know if you can add or contribute to this conversation. I think we have to see the Palestinians as human beings who are in a tragic situation who desperately need help. We need to see the Israelis as true human beings who are in a desperate situation who desperately need help. And we need to realize that this conflict goes back thousands of years, at the very least hundreds, at the very least decades, and that there's so much going on here. Presidents have tried to solve this problem, and they've not been able to solve this problem. I mean, Camp David became famous for its, the Camp David Accords trying to resolve some of the conflicts in the Middle East. And the reality is that the best minds and the most powerful people in the world have tried to bring peace to the Middle East and have failed. And so just some level of common sense would say this issue isn't as simple and as black and white as people want to make it to be.
I mean, this is probably one of the most complicated situations in the world, in our history, right?
Yeah.
Like how can two people groups hate each other so much on such a? And I was talking about this with one of our friends last night. We were in your kitchen, and you were doing essentially the first version of this, of what we're trying to do now, talking about how this has gone back to like a historical date, right? That this isn't two nations, this is two tribes of
It goes all the way back to Jacob and Esau, all the way back to Isaac and Ishmael. It goes back to the conflicts between brothers and cousins and family. You need to realize that even though they have
thousands of years of hate.
Yes, and whether they recognize it or not, Arabs and Israelis are family. This is actually a family conflict, and those are the hardest ones to fix. And ironically, when I used to work in more intense communities all the time, the police would tell me the most dangerous response for them was domestic violence. The most dangerous response for them was when they were walking into a house. And I actually think that the Middle East is actually like domestic violence. It is family fighting against family. It's brother against brother, cousin against cousin. And it becomes incredibly difficult. I did want to highlight a few things that, for me, inform me and remind me of what's going on. Because when you think about the way we process other cultural conflicts or issues, I think we're now aware. If you look at New Zealand, the way that they've gone back and recognized the abuse and the violation toward the Maori, and how the Maori were mistreated and displaced, and then in Australia with the Aboriginals realizing that there was an indigenous people there that were displaced and mistreated and alienated. And then we look here in the United States with the Native Americans, and historically we've called Indians, but of which I'm 25%, and the displacement of Native Americans and the atrocities and the injustices. I think sometimes we forget that Israel is a nation of refugees. We are in a time where we have a heightened awareness and empathy for refugees.
Right.
I mean, Kim and I have been to the Syrian-Lebanese border several times, working with the millions of refugees that are there, and And when you see the circumstance of refugees, it just heightens your empathy. We've had over 100, 150 Muslims in our home at one time because they were refugees from Syria dominantly and other Middle Eastern countries. And as a family, we've become a haven for refugees who are overwhelmingly Muslim. And so I'm saying this in this context. We need to realize that the nation of Israel is a nation of refugees. That when the nation of Israel was established in 1948, hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been oppressed and alienated and marginalized for the first time in modern history had a place called home. And so I hope we never forget that the history of Israel, the Israeli story, is a story of alienated, oppressed people, the victims of the Holocaust, and that Israel became for them their first hope of having a home. And so that for me creates an empathy that I don't ever want to lose, and that this is a nation of refugees. At the same time, when it's so amazing.
Was that smart though?
What?
To put, look, I'm going to speak very candidly, and I'm going to offend everyone, and then I want to hopefully offend no one because I'm just asking questions.
Right.
Obviously, the Holocaust happens, right?
Right.
And then the product of the Holocaust was establishing Israel as a nation in the Middle East, in a territory that was being continuously fought over for thousands of years, right? Even between Muslim nations. Was it wise to put Israel where Israel is now?
Well, I mean, years ago, I heard a Jewish comedian saying this was not the smartest thing to do, to put us in the middle of
a bunch of
regional world where, people do not want them to be. But I think you have to remember, you have to go back. Like if you go back in time, it wasn't until around the 7th century that the Middle East became Muslim. So that territory was Jewish. It was Israel. And so it was Israel before it was an Arab, part of the Arab Empire. And then, it goes back and forth with the Crusades around, I think, the 13th century. It became solidified as a Muslim territory. And that remained so for hundreds of years. And then after World War I, then World War II, when they divided the land up and put Israel there, on a global scale, they were giving Israel back the land that they had lost. And unfortunately, when there's war, there's always a redistribution of land and things like that. But what was odd to me, though, is that no one really considered what displacing the Palestinian people would do. And that's why I'm going, okay, the Israeli people clearly were not the violators. They were victims who were given a home. The Palestinian people did nothing wrong. Like they were
in that moment.
In that moment,
yeah, right.
And then suddenly they're alienated, and what was their home is no longer their home.
Being displaced and pushed into,
And so you can go back and go, but in the 600s that was all Israeli land. But in 1940, those people, they don't have the memory of 650 AD.
Right.
And if you could just give an equivalent, imagine someone coming to your house that you paid for, your home, and telling you, this is no longer yours, not for anything you did wrong, but governments have made a decision, and that your house now belongs to someone else.
Right.
And I think we need to realize that since 1948, there's always been the environment for hostility, for tension, for violence. And then when you add on top of that the theological tension, and because there really are no Islamic democracies. Like Islam doesn't really fundamentally work from a democratic mindset,
right?
And there isn't room for Judaism inside of an Islamic worldview, really.
It becomes a part of essentially the linchpin, right, in all of it, that there will be no happiness without the eradication of one or the other. In the other's mind.
In their minds, yeah. And so
Right.
that's why it's hard to have diplomatic solutions when neither think the other should exist, and especially in that territory. And then for Israel, I don't think have a universe in which Israel can be Jewish and Muslim.
Right.
And so the theology, the belief systems actually affect the politics. And so they're all fighting over the same piece of land. And then you add Jerusalem, that's a sacred city to Jews and Christians and Muslims and Baha'i and other religions.
Right.
And they're fighting over this, quote, holy ground.
So can I ask really cynical questions? So is it still a holy land when people are killing other people over it?
That's a really profound question.
Because you have this idea, right, that there's multiple religions, multiple people groups that are fighting over essentially a rock. And I'm not trying to belittle the Holy Land. I'm saying if you were to fighting over one space, right, one I'm trying not to
piece of land,
one piece of land,
yeah,
right, and so it becomes it's almost this very basic human. I don't even know, like, characteristic or attribute or test of time to go, if you give everyone one thing that is sacred, will they all kill each other to get it?
Yeah, you actually yesterday said to me, this is really Solomon's test.
Yes.
And I didn't know what you meant at first.
Yeah.
And he said, when the two women who said they were the mothers and the baby, and Solomon said, let's cut the baby in half. And the one mother said yes.
Right.
But the real mother said no, because she'd rather give up her baby and let her live
than let her die.
Yeah. And I thought, and you said, isn't this the case with Jerusalem? It's like whoever truly thinks it's sacred wouldn't be killing someone else for it.
Right.
And I thought that's a really profound thought.
It feels like two people groups who refuse to trust in God to give it to them. Right. And I asked you, and we were having a conversation of, like, say, because I come from the Christian side or the Jesus side of things, but also you have the Old Testament, the New Testament. So even if there were orders, even if my heritage believed that there were orders from God to take this holy land and to defend it with their life, and then to take over the tribes and destroy their enemies and XYZ, would I still believe the same thing thousands of years later after so many people have died? Would I go, is it worth it anymore? Mm-hmm. And not that does God's word devalues over time, but the question I asked was, do you think God spoke in that time and they never heard it? Right? Or do you think that they're misunderstanding something that happened thousands of years ago and holding onto a grudge that has developed over so many lives being lost over it?
Ironically, I think this is one of the dangers of religion.
Right. That
rituals or things become a higher value than people. Like there should be no universe in which a religion says you can kill people of another religion to take what you want.
Yeah.
Or because they disagree with you.
Right.
And in history, when Christians killed other people, it was wrong. In history, when Jews killed other people, it was wrong. And in history, when Muslims killed other people, it was wrong. When you're killing other people to take what you want, from my vantage point, it's always wrong. And even
there's tons of verses where God says, "Go and take this people group, go and drive them out of this land."
Yes, and that's a much longer conversation, but I think that was one of my struggles in actually becoming a person of faith.
Yeah.
And putting my trust in Jesus was coming to a coherent understanding of what happened in history. And I think we have to remember that humans are a species of war. God did not invent war in that sense. In the human arena, God was stepping into the reality of our violence and our war.
So is there like a quick summary you could do of why that maybe has changed over time, or why that shouldn't hold valid thousands of years later? Obviously, For us, I think Jesus comes into the story, and this idea of love your neighbor, love your enemies, treat everyone with kindness and love.
Right. When you look at the history in the Old Testament, the Hebraic scriptures, the purpose for the establishment of Israel wasn't for God to have a nation that he chose above all the other nations. The exclusivity story of Israel is a wrong understanding of the Bible. Israel was not chosen apart from other nations to be God's only people. The Bible actually teaches that Israel was chosen so that all the nations would know they're chosen.
Does the Old Testament teach this or the New Testament teach
Old
this?
Testament teaches this.
Old Testament teaches. So, okay.
That God wanted Israel to be a light to all the nations. That God, it's sort of like if 50 people are drowning, and you say, well, I don't want to be unfair, so I'm not going to save anyone first.
Right.
And no, if you want to save 50 people who are drowning, you have to choose one person
To go and get them.
to save.
Yeah.
And ironically,
to save, yes.
in interesting, in a lot of like survivalist theory, people who don't understand how to save people save the weakest people first. But actually, if you want to save the most people, you save the strongest people first. And then you position the strongest people to help you save other people. And interestingly enough, when you save the strongest people, the weakest people actually start getting stronger. And when you look at the scriptures, you're looking at going, I never have come to believe that God, quote, saved me because he preferred me over someone else. I think that God, in a sense, saves me from drowning so that I can have the moral obligation to save as many people as I can with my life.
That is a phenomenal metaphor, an explanation of this situation. It's incredible.
And I think somewhere along the way, regardless of the geopolitical issues, from a spiritual or theological perspective, certainly Israel forgot that it was here to be a light to all the nations. And then you look at it now, I don't even know that conversation's valid. Almost 50% of Israelites would consider themselves to be secular.
And yeah.
And so it's a lot of times Christians that are projecting the spiritual narrative into Israel rather than necessarily Israel carrying that spiritual narrative.
Right.
Israel sees itself as a nation, not as a religion.
Right.
But you brought in like the more recent situation. And frankly, people have been asking me, and I've been really reticent to have a conversation about it because I'm aware how little I know or understand or can fix.
Because it is so complex, and oftentimes it feels like it originates in something that is so important but so small, and then blows up to 1,000 missiles being launched overnight, and then 1,000 missiles being launched back to defend itself. And then I know that and I think some people would hear that and go, well, Israel does this. And then you're like, no, but Palestine does this. And then it becomes an eye for an eye. And we were talking about it last night. It was like Israel has been a nation that when it's an eye for an eye, it's an eye for a body. And it's become a wildly destructive solution to on both ends, right? Because I've become, if anything, pro to not being pro either. I'm going, there has to be a more human solution to something that is so violently destructive. And I was saying this, I called you and I said, how is it that we can put drug dealers in prison for selling something that is now legal, weed, but we can't find the person who gave either nation 1,000 missiles? Well, it was probably us that gave one side, and then probably some other people who gave the others. But there's no ramification for putting weapons of mass destruction, whether it's nuclear or a missile or a bullet, into hands of people who are vehemently irresponsible with weapons and things that they say to protect themselves to destroy other people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think one of the things, because one of the things we try to do with Ballot Ready is to give people language to have more constructive conversations, healthier conversations.
And to look at it from a different perspective, right? I think I say that because I do think that a huge thing with Ballot Ready is to not pick one side or the other, to try to find the truth between both. Yeah. And to go, we have to look at this from a human perspective.
Right. So here's what I would say to all the Christians listening who are pro-Israel.
Yes.
make sure when you're pro-Israel and you're communicating your beliefs, your convictions, I'm not saying you shouldn't have them, make sure that you include in your conversation empathy and concern for the victims on the Palestinian side. And don't create a blanket declaration of wrong on one side or the other. Pay attention to what's going on. Pay attention to the tragedy. Pay attention to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Make sure that you advocate and fight for the human rights of the Palestinian people as well. Even if you hold a pro-Israel position, it doesn't mean that it should eliminate from you a deep concern as a follower of Jesus for the Palestinian people.
And I think that as whatever religion you or spiritual journey you are on or associate with, we have to, I think it's a huge miss that people who follow Jesus aren't more vocal about what's going on the Palestinian side.
Yeah.
Like, because whether, and obviously there's so much heaviness on both, right? But it's like, just don't pick the obvious stance. You have to find the deeper story in it.
I love that. And people forget there are actually Palestinian Christians there too. And there are actually Christians in Palestine who are suffering and are victims of this conflict. And then if you're a person who is a pro-Palestinian and you are absolutely certain that the Palestinians are right, that Israel is completely in the wrong.
Yeah.
I'm just going to encourage you to take a moment and step back and remember that the Israelites are a people of refuge. They were refugees. They were displaced. They have been the victims of some of the most horrific acts of violence and atrocities that modern history has ever known.
Yeah.
And any conversation that forgets the deep wounding and scars of the Israeli people, I think, is an inadequate conversation about how to resolve this conflict.
And can we kind of wrap it up with this one question? Because I don't know if I got you to give me are we good? Are you good?
Yeah, no, I was looking at the time.
I think we get three more minutes.
But also I wanted to ask them if they had some questions they thought maybe we should address. But go ahead.
Okay. Is the Holy Land still holy? Can you call a land that is covered in blood still holy?
I think we just should let that question sit a little bit. And I tend to believe that God is less interested in geography than he is interested in humanity. And that what should be our focus is not making the Holy Land holy, but we should be making humans humane. And so I think talking about Jerusalem as the Holy Land is a declaration of its historical value and significance, but it certainly is not a fair description of its story in regard to the treatment of each other as people. And, one of the things I noticed in terms of, can you have a civilized war? And I was thinking today how in a civilized war, you have soldiers going to war against soldiers killing soldiers. And, how killing can ever be civilized. But if you just go with me for a moment.
Right.
In a civilized war, soldiers go to war and they know they're going to war against other soldiers. In an uncivilized war, soldiers kill civilians. And soldiers kill civilians. And when that war becomes so inhumane that it loses its moral compass completely, women and children become the targets of violence and hostility. And what really concerns me is when we can't see the difference. A retaliation or an action from governments against other political or military forces, that's one conversation you have to have. But when you attack civilians in retribution or in an attempt to advance your cause, that to me is an inhumanity that's intolerable, and that's where we have to like be involved on a global scale. And there, when Germany was led by Hitler, he went to war against Russia, and he went to war against England, and he went to war against France and Poland. And it's interesting in the history of man, history of mankind or humankind, we know nations go to war against nations, but what leaves us almost with a historic like scar is when we go, but the 40 million Jews.
Yes.
But the women and children
were massacred.
Who were massacred, who never raised a weapon, who never warred against your ideology. We have a sense there's an inhumanity to that. It's that I can only describe as evil. And I think this is where there are people who are really concerned about human rights on both ends at a deep level. And we have to never be silent for any defenseless human in any one of these conflicts. And, I've thought I'm going to have some conversations with some Palestinian leaders and some Muslim leaders and some Jewish leaders and maybe think through some of the nuances of this more.
Yeah.
And so maybe we could actually have a follow-up Battle Ready in the future.
Yeah, no, I think it would be really, I mean, we're talking about this from our own perspective and from our understanding and our brief understanding. I mean, yours so much more in depth, but I think the historical context, but I think of what's unwrapping now, it's day to day and it's continual. So I think it'd be great, or continuous, and I think it'd be great to have a conversation next week or soon where we can pull in some voices and ask some questions. Yeah,
my main goal for this Battle Ready, and frankly, you pulled me into this one. You're the one that wanted to have this conversation.
I think it's good.
And I think my main goal is, one, we should all be praying for peace in the Middle East, and we should be praying for the safety, the security of both the people of Israel and the Palestinian people. We should be praying that leadership would emerge that has the kind of wisdom that can bring a resolution and bring peace to this region of the world.
Right.
And then we should be careful in our language to dehumanize either side, and make sure that we do not allow ourselves to be dragged down by the lowest level of thinking, where we create an enemy that's we're no longer able to see as a human being. And let's start there. Let's start there. And so I'm going to be praying for peace in Israel. I'm going to be praying for peace and for the Palestinian people. But beyond that, I think that the Middle East is so volatile, and we need to be praying that some spiritual. I think this is. I do think at the core of it all, it is spiritual, and I pray that there is a spiritual revolution throughout all the Middle East, where peace can reign, where people can see themselves in a place where they can be at peace with people who disagree with them, where people can have different beliefs, different, ideologies, different religions, and live at peace with each other side by side.
Yeah, it's so good. We're going to wrap it up right there. Just want to say thank you for listening to the Battle Ready podcast. Every single person who rates and reviews this podcast on iTunes, we are so grateful for you. If you haven't yet, please do rate and review this. Leave a comment. Let us know you're listening. Thank you for everyone who listens and watches on YouTube. And it's so good to be able to have these conversations together. I think they're really important, and I'm really looking forward to the future of what we're doing. And thank you for every person who supports this podcast on Anchor. People sponsor this podcast, and it's pretty cool. I think we have 140 people who give each month, from 99 cents to $9.99, and it's really, really special. So I love you, Dad, and I'm grateful we get to have these conversations. We'll see you next Friday.
All right. Take care.
Bye.